Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Casey. I'm the director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. On behalf of our co-hosts of today's proceedings, the World Faith Development Dialogue and the Berkley Center, I would like to welcome you to the G20 Interfaith Forum North American Regional Consultation. This convening takes place against the background of a world in turmoil, and today's programming reflects that fact. The global COVID-19 pandemic, the political upheaval in the United States as we enter the final months of a pivotal presidential election, global religious communities and networks facing internal and external pressures, rising populist tides. All of these factors combine to threaten the global international order as we have come to know it. G20 interfaith forums are preceded by preparatory events and discussions often focused on specific world regions. This North American regional event of the G20 Interfaith Forum will focus on three primary topics. Number one, refugees and forced migration. Number two, religious responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. And three, anti-racism and religious responsibilities. Leaders from religious communities and networks focused on global policies are going to frame each topic and highlight relevant actions the G20 leaders and religious communities should consider at the G20 Interfaith Forum in October. Let me tell you a little bit about the Berkley Center. Our mission is to seek a more just and peaceful world by deepening knowledge and solving problems at the intersection of religion and global affairs through research, teaching, and engaging multiple publics. I commend to you our website as it contains a wealth of resources on all three of these subjects and a plethora of other topics as well. It contains a wealth of resources, and I would say we draw on experts drawn from across the globe. So I commend those resources to you. Let me close by thanking all of our participants, with special thanks to Catherine Marshall and the WFDD team, and along with Berkley Center staff who've labored long and hard hours to bring you this program today. So again, welcome, thanks for joining us, and now I turn it over to Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sean, and welcome to all of you. Let me first just do the classic, now classic Zoom reminders. This event is being recorded. The recording will be on the Berkley Center as well as other websites very soon. We will, for any who registered for the final event of this week's different sessions, you will receive the link on the day before. And the same applies for those of you who have indicated that you would like to be part of the three working group sessions. So with no further ado, let me pass to the president of the G20 Interfaith Association, Cole Durham. Good morning, Cole.
So as president of the G20 Interfaith Forum Association, let me also begin by expressing thanks to all who have made this North American regional consultation possible. We owe particular thanks to Catherine Marshall at the Berkley Center, which is hosting this event, for her collaborators and staff there, as well as to the World Faith Development Dialogue that she heads. We also owe thanks and recognition to other partners in this year's G20 Interfaith Forum in Saudi Arabia, notably to KAICID, the UN Alliance of Civilizations, and the National Committee for Interfaith and Intercultural Dialogue in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The G20 Interfaith Forum is an initiative designed to draw on religious voices and relevant experts from around the world to contribute to substantive policy formation at the level of the annual G20 Summit. The G20 Summit itself brings leaders from the world's leading economies together annually to discuss policy initiatives. It dates back to the economic crisis of 2008 and has always had a significant economic focus. But over the past decade, it has worked as well on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And anyone who has examined these goals realizes that they cannot be achieved without taking religious contributions and synergies into account. The aim of the G20 Interfaith Forum is to facilitate doing so. Interfaith initiatives linked to the G20 Forum go back to the first years of the G20 process, with special credit going to Canadian interfaith groups and the World Faith Development Dialogue, as well as Japanese partners in the early years. The present iteration of the G20 Interfaith Forum dates back to the G20 Summit in Australia in 2014 and has involved events linked to each successive G20 summit. The forum operated for several years as an informal association, but was incorporated in 2019 to provide more formal structure. This year's regional consultations have reached a wider audience and have benefited from inputs from a more diverse group of religious leaders and policy experts than ever before. Today and through this week, the focus will be on refugees and forced migration, anti-racism and religious responsibilities, and through it all, religious responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. We will be consolidating comments and ideas received from this region and from other regions around the world to feed into the global G20 Interfaith Forum based in Saudi Arabia in October. We look forward to successful discussions today and running through the week. Thanks to all who have made this possible, and especially to those of you who are participating in today's webinar and the subsequent events this week. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cole. Let me now turn to His Excellency Faisal bin Muammar, the Secretary General of KAICEED.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Dr. Cole. Thank you, Sean Casey. My name is Faisal bin Muammar, the Secretary General of KAICEED in Vienna. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to address you today on behalf of KAICEED. On behalf of KAICEED, a key partner of the G20 Interfaith Forum. Sorry, I think there is something wrong with the connection. It is a pleasure to address you today on behalf of KAICEED, a key partner of the G20 Interfaith Forum 2020 in Saudi Arabia. KAICEED has been involved with the Interfaith Forum since 2017, providing support for past summits in Germany, Japan, and Argentina, and with further plans to support the 2021 summit in Italy. The aim of this forum to bring religious voices to the policy table at the G20 summit reflects exactly that what KAICEED was established to achieve. We are an intergovernmental organization founded by Saudi Arabia, Austria, and Spain, with the Holy See as a founding observer. We also have a board of directors with representatives from Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Judaism, and Islam. We thus bridge the gap between religious and policy in our architecture and in our work. We support networks of religious leaders and religious institutions in Myanmar, the Central African Republic, the Arab region, and in Nigeria, parts of the world where social cohesion is greatly threatened by religious conflicts. But also these are parts of the world where religious institutions and faith-based organizations are at the forefront of providing humanitarian and other support to communities in need. We believe that policymakers have things to learn from these religious voices. The G20 Interfaith Forum aims to do this very same things at the global level. Our meeting here today is fifth in a series of regional meetings where we have gathered religious leaders and experts such as yourselves to bring a religious perspective to bear on the many shared challenges we face today, and most importantly, to recommend action to the world leaders of G20. Previous meetings have collected participants from the Arab region, Europe, Latin America, and Asia. In each region, we discuss the unique challenges of the people of those countries and societies. These are tailored to the priorities of the host country, in this case, Saudi Arabia, and this year they are women and youth, empowering people by creating the conditions in which all people, especially women and youth, can live, work, and thrive. Climate change, safeguarding the planet by fostering collective efforts to protect our global commons. Technology, shaping new frontiers by adopting long-term and bold strategies to share benefits of invention and technological advancement. But of course, there are also overriding global issues that we need to overcome together. And the most visible one, of course, is COVID-19, the hidden enemy. This pandemic has changed our world in a few short months, but at the same time, it has exposed fault lines and inequalities that were also part of our world: racism, xenophobia, and disinformation, making it harder for us to combat crises such as COVID-19. Climate change and conflicts, the world looks to the leaders of G20 for answers to these problems, but it is our hope that these world leaders will look to the religious leaders to provide the moral and ethical guidelines to these world leaders, and to provide their unique perspective to solving these problems. I would like to thank you, Catherine, and Dr. Cole and Sean Casey, and to all listeners of my speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I now have a great honor and privilege to introduce General Romeo Dallaire, who will be our keynote speaker today, and who will provide us with framing and also an inspiration. General Dallaire is one of the great advocates for human rights. He is someone with a varied career. He knows politics, he knows writing, speaking. He's obviously has a very distinguished military career. And he also lived through one of the crises that marks us, that scars, I think, all of our souls, which is the genocide in Rwanda and similar events in Burundi. All of the biographies of these distinguished people today are on the website, so we're not going to do lengthy introductions, but I do direct you to them because each of them has a story and a history that is important. But let me, with no further ado, turn to General Dallaire.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. And thank you very much. And thank you for organizing this significant and rather challenging session together in preparation for the G20. I want to thank Sean and Ruth, of course, and Colin, if I may, also Faisal, for the words of setting the scene for this week. And when I received the request, the issues as was identified as the religious responses to the COVID-19 emergency, the refugee and internally displaced issue, and racism. And I was asked to be more specific in looking at, in fact, and drawing from the experience of the Rwanda-Burundi situation that happened just over 25 years ago, and the issues of refugees and race in particular, and the questions that they have raised, and maybe even a solution or a comment, if I may be permitted to do so. I left Rwanda with a lot of questions that were unanswered, and the depth of the moral injury, let alone the ethical dilemmas and the decisions in regards to the operations on the ground. The most difficult dimension of all that was, in fact, the moral injury, the injury of witnessing with next to no ability to influence the slaughter of close to 1 million people and the displacement of up to 3.9 million people in the space of less than 100 days. And add to that another 300,000 from Burundi, and these out of small populations of 8 million, 7 million or so. And so the questions that pursued me were, well, are all humans human? The responses to my calls for support in regards to the worsening situation, ultimately the genocide, were unheeded. I could not keep the few troops I had on the ground, and ultimately only about 400, while at the same time, in ex-Yugoslavia, we were deploying 67,000 troops. Why was there a difference? Are all humans actually human? Or do some actually consider them to be more human than others? And is that possible? Then the other questions that came up was, of course, the concept of the genocide, which was based on a race, ethnic links, and when did that start? And what created that explosion, not of the plane being shot down, but the explosion of a fundamentally Catholic population up to 90%, and Protestant for about 8%, and then some Muslim believers in Rwanda, but people who had been strong practicing, religious focused, spiritually guided population. How was it possible that they could turn on their neighbors, on their brothers, their sisters, and not only kill and slaughter with wanton abandon, and using children, youth, to do most of the killing, which is even more perverse than one could imagine, as using the future generations to kill a current generation, but also the humiliation and the injuries and the gross destruction, the martyrdom of so many people, the desire to make them suffer, not just eliminate them, but to make them suffer in so doing and in humiliation. How did that come so strong and override neighbors, intermarried families, and very practicing Christians for the most part? And in so doing, how does that continue to evolve with added pressure such as COVID-19? We see race frictions that explode. We see economic disparities that create, in fact, a desire and anger in populations who are not getting a reasonable exchange of resources for their well-being and the future generations compared to others in, let's say, the same country. We see still in certain areas tribalism, small scale, yet that they explode to destabilize nations. And I've seen that in Somalia, I've seen it in the South Sudan now, I witnessed it in the Congo, in Rwanda, in Burundi. These frictions explode, they spread, and based on somebody born from another group, another organization, another basic entity, yet all still human, but not perceived as human. How, in fact, were they able to turn human beings into cockroaches in Rwanda, and as such gave them the sort of easy way of ultimately destroying an ethnic group and a race by treating them as non-human? So are all humans human? And can we actually see that position being sustained in the global environment where an added pressure like COVID-19 is not only creating now frictions and disparities, but is creating enormous stresses on how we're going to pull ourselves out of this, and who will get the priority of the resources needed to actually come out of it. And will that generate frictions within societies, within nations, within different racial groups, and create ultimately more human destruction? And then you get even extreme scenarios like I was in Darfur, where African-based Sudanese were being targeted to be eliminated. And in fact, women being raped by militias to create, literally, impregnate them to create another race that was not an Arab-based Sudanese, certainly didn't want anymore to have African-based Sudanese, but something else. So actually deliberately trying to create humans that were not in any way offensive to them, the majority, and ultimately eliminate a race that was also very much part of their nation. So this continued quest for answers led me to trying to figure out maybe some of the genesis of these elements, as they are still, these frictions continue to explode, and we still see human beings using lethal force and all kinds of the disparities and destruction means of trying to eliminate, trying to get rid of, trying to subjugate other human beings who live close at hand or are participating in the future of maybe that nation, that grouping. So I went back and I said, when did really the idea that this genocide start as an option for the future of, as an example, Rwanda? And a similar scenario was going on in Burundi with the same ethnic and racial distribution. Was it before the colonial era where the Germans were in there and they were supporting one group towards the other? Was it the post-World War I when the Belgians were in there and they reinforced one group versus another group? Did that actually create the initial divisions? Was it when they actually got independence and the group that had been subjugated, although a majority, was now in a position of power and being supported by the ex-colonial power? Or was it when the Hutus who had been expelled from the country in the early 60s during the revolutionary period of the post-colonial era, was it they're trying to come back enough of the friction to create such a fear of sharing power with another group that an idea of a genocide actually would come to the fore? So in my looking at this, and with the Montreal Institute of Genocide Studies, where I've been doing my research and writing over the years, I got involved with Kofi Annan's, who invited me to join the Genocide Prevention Advisory Group with people like David Hemberg, with Desmond Tutu, and Bob Orr, and so on. And we were looking at, how do we get ahead of this? How do you prevent these frictions from going to that extreme? How ultimately can you nip this concept of people not being equal? It's one thing to tolerate, and I think that is a very, very prejudicial statement. Who am I to tolerate someone else? How can I actually use a verb like that, tolerating? What pretentious position do I take to actually articulate something like that? Respect, different. If I respect others, then I'm treating them as equal. and if I treat them as equal, that in fact might be able to reduce the impact of some of the frictions that do differentiate us, but that certainly should not be the reason for us to use lethal force against the other, unless we feel that in fact these frictions have gone beyond what we consider to be fair, and that they actually think that by the use of force, by eliminating, by subjugating another group, you guarantee your own status, your own continuity. And that has got to be a perverse reflection and an absolute destruction of the logic of what humanity is. I mean, humanity, I do not believe it to be Darwinian. I believe that fundamentally every human being seeks serenity for themselves, for those around them. Seek it through means, be they hopefully political and economic and security, of course, spiritually, to reinforce their depth of who they are and who those around them are. And in so doing, give them an enlightened perspective that we're all the same. This little boy during the Rwandan genocide that I found in the middle of no man's land, who was starving and dirty and mangy and flies all around him, abandoned as I was making my way through no man's land to negotiate the movement of people between the lines. This little boy, I looked at him and I saw his bloated stomach, and he was in rags and he smelled and he was dirty and there were flies around him. But then I looked into his eyes. And what I saw in the eyes of that little boy was exactly what I saw in the eyes of my 7-year-old son that I had left here in Quebec, Canada, when I went off to Africa to that mission. They were the eyes of a human child, and they were exactly the same. How is it? How is it that we perpetuate that? I know where my son sits in the scheme of things in this country and ultimately in the world. But what created a scenario that that little boy ended up in the midst of a slaughter, a genocide, and ultimately a destruction of everything that he could have as a reference? For ultimately we found him, after we were seeking people to help him in no man's land and found only bodies, we actually refound him in a hut where his 2 adults had been slaughtered weeks beforehand. Nothing is there. And so this continuum of humanity needs depth of belief that human beings are equal. There is no human more human than the other. And in so doing, if all humans are equal, then is it possible that we are still using some of the frictions that exist between us, created by nationalism, created by political will, created by race, color, religion? Is it possible that these can still influence us, even though we have written so much, we have produced so much, from international criminal courts to conventions and so on, the world is joined in, that we can still see the solution coming too often by the destruction, literally destruction of others, and the introduction of new weapons to conduct that. I mean, rape as a weapon of war now, standard weapon of internal conflicts, imploding nation, civil wars. Another weapon that's being used is the use of children, child soldiers. I met with Pope Francis not quite a year ago, asking him to help me and my organization as we are working in South Sudan to try to find ways to bring people together. And one of the areas that we have been doing research on was the fact that the presence of children in armed groups, the mobilization of children, gives all the different factions power, and they build their wars and sustain them on the backs of kids. They create generational wars, wars that cannot easily be eradicated from the minds of those who have participated when they're youths and have had nothing else, no studies, no money, no opportunity to marry, no answer to their hopes, and certainly if there are prayers, no seemingly answer to their prayers. How can we get children out of the equation of this era of conflict and actually reduce the capability of adults to sustain war and to pursue conflict and to see that the use of children, if adults are ready to use children to conduct these civil wars and these mass atrocities, then that means they're ready to go right to the extreme, and that means even genocide, which means that we're killing people, slaughtering people by using the children of our generations against them. And that speaks of a continuum that can be broken. And it can be broken not just by the laws and so on, can be broken by engagement and by a belief that children used as weapons of war to fight adult wars should be unthinkable. Don't tell me, not to use them. I'm saying do not even imagine that we should be using children as instruments of war. And so I put, if I may use the term, faith in youth. Youth who are used as the front end of too many conflicts still by state and non-state actors, but the youth who are mastering the technologies of communications around the world, the stuff we're using right now, but they under the under 25s, they master it. They're making this stuff dance. They're leaping ahead with it. They have the opportunity to bring humanity together because they are already global. They are the generation without borders. Educate, support, give them the opportunity to communicate and to continuously have access to more and more and more of these instruments of our modern era to reduce and eliminate these borders and to continue to pursue the desire, fundamental desire, that who we're looking at in the screen is equal to me. We are just as human, me and you. And in so doing, I have no other option but to respect. And in that respect, work out the frictions that do not lead to the use, ultimately, of a racial subjugation and ultimately even a racial destruction of men, women, and children, with abandonment and with a horror that, ladies and gentlemen, I still can't describe 25 years later. And so this gathering is significant. The themes are outstanding, and we need spiritual guidance. We need depth. We need something to bring us to a stronger position of what we are in our humanity, and ultimately prove to ourselves through our spiritual guidance that we are all equal, and that it is respect that will establish peace in humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, General Dallaire. I think you have brought the issues of human rights into the most effective and the most powerful analogies that I've heard in a long time, and highlighted, I think, the G20 mandate, which is a responsibility to respect as well as a responsibility to protect and a responsibility to act. So thank you so much. We'll be reflecting in many ways on the wise comments, but above all, the questions that you have put to us. We're going to turn now to three pairs of colleagues who will each introduce and reflect on the topics among so many that we have chosen to highlight for this event. First of all, the refugee forced migration challenge and the roles that religious actors play. Secondly, the responses to the COVID pandemic, which covers so many of the challenges in the SDGs that Cole highlighted and others. And finally, an issue that's so much on our minds in North America now, which is how do we address this terrible legacy that we have inherited of racial issues. So first, and again with very, very light introductions, I will introduce the refugee topic, which will be led by my colleague, David Hollenbach, professor at Georgetown, Jesuit, I would say, leader, and Aidan Batar, who is working on refugee issues now, and who was himself a refugee, and so can speak to that experience in a way that few others can do. So with that, I will turn over to David. You have only 20 minutes. Each of you has to deal with a colossal world challenge in a very short period of time, but remember that we will be addressing and dealing with these issues in more depth in the days to come. David?
Thank you very much, Catherine. And I would like to see what I say as a real kind of building upon what General Dallaire has said about our common humanity. We can talk about the refugee crisis that we face today that in two ways, it seems to me. First of all, there is the crisis facing the suffering of the people who have been displaced from their homes. We know from the most recent data from the High Commissioner for Refugees that today there are almost 80 million people who have been forcibly displaced in the world today. It is the highest number that we have seen on recorded history, really. It's the highest, certainly the highest number since the Second World War, and it has been growing and increasing dramatically over the last decade. This comes about due to the conflicts that divide people, that cause the breakdown of the solidarity of our common humanity. So the refugee crisis is not only the crisis facing the people who are suffering, but it's a crisis facing our humanity as a human community, the commonality that binds us together. We could say that humanity as a community has been fractured. We are building walls, we are excluding people, we are turning people back when they come across the sea in plastic boats. It is a very severe problem. And it's due to a number of causes. War, of course, is one of the central causes of refugee displacement today. Internal conflicts within countries based on ethnicity, based on religion, based upon race. These are very real causes of all the displacement that we face in the world today. We see a rising displacement due to environmental changes. We see a rising displacement due to the poverty and the way that poverty contributes to violence and warfare. We also know that this conflict is not the sole source of the suffering of refugees. It is also the fact that so many countries are increasingly unwilling to grant asylum to people who are facing them coming to their borders. We are seeing a number of people turning people who are in great need back because of the fear of being infected by COVID. So the COVID crisis has led to an increasing boundaries being drawn among people. So what do we do about this? Well, I would suggest that one of the contributions that can be made by faith communities is to build upon their deep traditions that are basically committed to the common humanity that we all share. We know that religion can be a source of conflict. We have seen that in any number of parts of the world. But we also know that at its deepest level, almost all religions believe in the common humanity we share with one another. There is a genuine religious basis when religion is properly interpreted and not misinterpreted in nationalistic directions, that religion can be a source of genuine response to the refugee situation and to the crisis of displaced people in the world today, both by responding to the needs of people who have been displaced, but also by helping to build up our sense of our common humanity. We know that many of the agencies that work to assist refugees on the ground in camps and in urban areas to which they have been displaced are faith-based. You can look at any number of the large humanitarian agencies in the world today, and you will find among them major religious groups, such as World Vision, which is an evangelical Christian group, or Catholic Relief Services, which is a very major Catholic organization functioning around the world. Islamic Relief, working to bring assistance to people around the world, independent of their faith, based on need, not on creed. The response can be. So we see that the religious community is playing an important role in responding to the needs of refugees. But this is also rooted in the deep beliefs of these traditions when they are properly understood. If you look at the major monotheistic traditions of the Western world, you will see within them a deep commitment to the common humanity that we all share. And this is true of Asian religions too, Hinduism and Buddhism. For example, Christians believe that all human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, as do Jewish people. All Muslims believe that we have been created, as the Quran puts it, on the form of God. We have been created to know one another, the Quran says, so that this common humanity that binds us together as one human race and reaches across borders is a very central belief in major religious traditions of the world. How Hindus believe that the Dharma, according to which all people would live, is a common law that binds all humans together. Buddhists believe that all human beings are bound to each other through compassionate response to those who are suffering. And we have in many religious traditions a strong conviction that response to the needs of those who are displaced is very important. The major religious traditions, the monotheistic traditions of the West, Judaism and Christianity, all have forced migration as part of their founding experience. The Jewish community began at the time of the Exodus, being from Egypt, began through an experience of exile when the Jewish people were displaced to Babylon. Christianity has as a fundamental belief not only the common humanity of all people, but that humanity reaches across borders. For example, the parable of the Good Samaritan told by Jesus says it's not only the Jewish person who walks down the road and doesn't see the Samaritan in the ditch, but the person in the ditch. It's the Samaritan, the outsider, who sees need, who is held up as a model of what it is to love one's neighbor as oneself. And Islam began, the beginning of Islam is marked from Muhammad's hijrah, his migration from Mecca to Medina, the founding of founding event of Islam was a migration, a forced migration of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. And this gives these religious traditions a strong conviction that their response to refugees should be at the center of their believers' lives. In addition, I think religious communities can provide hope to those who are suffering from forced migration. The beliefs in a God whose compassion reaches beyond all borders, the belief in a God who shares the struggle and the suffering of people through God's own merciful presence, compassionate presence to people, gives people who have been displaced a genuine hope that their displacement is not the final word. The love of God and the care of God is the final word. And it also energizes those who are working to help them. People who work in refugee camps and humanitarian agencies have a tough time keeping at it for the long haul. And religious faith, I think, is a source of work for the long haul. In addition, religious communities can serve refugees in a particular way because religious communities are genuinely transnational. They reach across borders. Christianity is present around the world. Islam is present around the world. Judaism is present in many parts of the world. Buddhism is all over East Asia and in the United States and the Western world as well. Being a member of each of these communities is a way of showing that borders are not the final word. And this gives these communities an institutional basis across borders for responding to those in need. Finally, I would say that the challenge of response to refugees today is a particular challenge in responding to the fact that most refugees in the world today are not in the developed countries like the United States or Western Europe. Most refugees are in poor countries. 85% are in developing countries, and almost a third of the refugees in the world today are in the very poorest countries in the world today. So the response of economic concern for those who are poor, that is part of the religious belief of all major religious traditions, means that we should be working to bring the developed countries of the world to the assistance of those developing and poor countries that are hosting most of the world's refugees. We fear that there are too many refugees coming to the United States and Europe. But if you look at countries like Uganda, where there are millions of South Sudanese refugees, or places like Beirut of Lebanon, where there are millions of Syrian refugees, or Turkey, coming to the assistance, or Afghanistan, where there are so many, these poorer countries where there are so many refugees present need the assistance of those from the developed world. And the religious communities of the world, because of their transnational reach, can reach across those borders and come to the urge the developed countries to come to the aid of their developing brothers and sisters. So let me end there and turn it over to Aiden Battar, who has more concrete experience as a refugee himself and working on the ground with a faith-based organization that is turning to the assistance of refugees. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thanks everyone for attending this important conference. As David mentioned, I have a background being a refugee myself, and also that's the reason why I do the work that I do in helping others who came before or after me as a refugee. I came originally from Somalia, and I was forced to flee my hometown due to the civil war. I think the majority of the refugees are fleeing their home country because of war, and also, with that war created by other reasons. So I'm just going to talk to you in practical, the work that I do, and also in general, also why are we doing this work in resettling refugees. As you know that today over 80 million people are forcibly displaced by wars and other inhumane conditions. Of those 70 million individuals that have been forced to flee their home countries, over 40 million of those are trapped in their home countries. We call it internally displaced individuals. They don't have other means to leave their home countries. They are at the mercy of their persecutors. So these are what we're seeing in Syria, what we're seeing in many parts of the country, and that these individuals do not have any protection whatsoever. Only about a little over 26 million are in the refugee camp. Those are the ones that are escaped and in refugee camps. And also we have seen an influx of asylum seekers that are coming to the southern border of the United States or other countries, that are seeking asylum, that we're closing our borders and we're telling them, you go back where you came from, and which is really, inhumane to do that. We have seen in our southern border of the United States that, children are being put into cages, and that, and we're telling them to wait here until you're granted asylum or something like that, which is really, what we shouldn't be doing. So these refugees that escaped and, are in the refugee camps, 80% of them are in developing countries. The developing countries are pretty much providing more, refugee than in the, in the Western countries, which I think that's also shows us how these countries, I'm not saying we're not compassionate, but we do have compassion. But I think the developing countries, we see the heavy lifting work that they're doing that always need our support, because they cannot deal with that influx of refugees that are coming into their countries, like Uganda, like Pakistan, Kenya, Turkey, and many other countries that today are hosting the largest refugee population that are coming into their countries. So where are they come from? These refugees that are fleeing their home countries. I would say more than 60% of them are coming from Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Syria. I think in Syria, the refugee numbers are really increasing as this war in Syria continue. Every day, a lot of people have been killed. So over 50% of the refugees worldwide are women and children. And those that do not have anyone to protect them are suffering the most, that need our protection. I just want to touch a little bit about where we are with the resettlement and the refugees. I go back to 2016 because it has a significant, before that year and what happening after that year. In 2006, more than 30 countries have been resettling refugees worldwide, and almost close to 100 different nationalities or even more have been resettled in the world. And over close to 200,000 people were resettled during those times. In the United States, we've been accepting historically, about 85,000 refugees. Then what happened after 2016 with the election of President Donald Trump? We have seen how the number of refugees went down. And the US, we came down from 85,000 to now, we only resettling about 10,000, which is a significant cut. And also the rhetoric that came with that also have impacted the refugees resettlement in the United States. We have seen a large number of refugees coming into our border, and that we are closing and that we're not allowing them to come. So this gets back to us, why is it so important, the refugee resettlement? And we have seen over the years since World War II and then after, we have seen millions of people have been provided resettlement in many countries. In the US alone, we have resettled close to 4 million refugees that escaped from different wars throughout the years. And this is a life-saving program. If we stop this program, many people are gonna lose their lives. That resettlement is the only opportunity for these individuals to come to the host countries. Otherwise, we know that this countries that where people are seeking refuge, it's not safe for them to go back. We know that, they can't stay in those refugee camps that are overcrowded, overpopulated, and they're not getting the basics. So we need to help these developing countries that are hosting the largest refugee population so they can provide the basic needs that these refugees are in need. And also, we need to share the responsibility with the developing countries. We don't want them to host all this country. As our president put together, said in the last, the UN convention, when we were talking about refugees, the refugees are better off in the refugee camp. That is not what refugees, they're better off. The refugees are better off to go back to their home country when it's safe, or to provide a resettlement opportunity, which I think that is what we always in need, and also as a faith community all of us that we've been providing resettlement for refugees. As David mentioned, the faith communities do the largest, refugee services. Out of the 9 national voluntary agencies in the United States, 7 of them are faith-based organizations that resettle refugees. We as Catholics are the largest when it comes to resettling refugees, and this is the right things to do. This is what our faith, all of us, teaches us to do the right things. Otherwise, if we don't, we see people, being, lost their lives in front of us. So what do we do in response, to provide services for the refugees as a faith community? What do we do? I think one of the biggest things that we do as a faith community, in the United States is that we welcome refugees with open arms. In our Catholic network here in the U.S., we have a program called, Parishes Organized to Welcome Immigrants and Refugees throughout the country. So we welcome individuals as they come into the United States and help them the services that they need so they can successfully integrate into our community. But I think that opportunity we have not been given, as not many refugees are coming to our communities. We have the resources, that we can provide those services to the refugees. But I think politically, that is what tying our hand that, of those 70, 80 million that are in the refugee, that we can provide a safe and haven. So I think, what I would like to conclude with my topic is that, we need to do more advocacy to reach out to our, countries and pressure our political leaders to make sure that, we need to provide more safe haven for those individuals that have been forced to flee their home countries. I think politically, we need to force those countries that are forcing those people to flee their home countries. The political solution, that is, I think, the biggest thing that we would like to see happening. If that is not happening, then a resettlement opportunity needs to be allowed those refugees to come. I think, we can continue talking more on this topic, but I would like to say that, to thank those that are doing the largest heavy lifting in those developing countries that are, welcoming the refugees into their home country. I like to give a lot of credit to those countries that I mentioned earlier that, no matter how hard it is for them, no matter how crowded into their home countries, they still allowing refugees to come to their countries and they're not closing our border. And I would like to send a message to, our president here in the United States that we need to be compassionate. We need to open our borders. We need to allow refugees and immigrants to come to our country. Our community can do more to welcome and to provide a safe haven for the refugees. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. I think you've raised both the framing, the ethical framing, but also given us a lot of very specific questions as we continue with this discussion, both tomorrow and over the weeks ahead. We're going to turn now to the COVID crisis, where we have,
Sorry, I didn't quite.
excuse me? we're turning to the COVID crisis, and Olivia Wilkinson, who has been a partner in highlighting the response of faith communities to the COVID crisis, together with the Berkley Center and WFDD. And we also have Ruth Messenger, who has a wonderfully broad experience and a very powerful voice. And the two of them will, again, provide us with a set of questions and challenges as we look to the days ahead, very much with faith and with the G20 in mind. So over to you. I think, Olivia, you're starting, right?
Thanks, Catherine. Yes, I'm starting and I'll hand over to Ruth. So hello, everyone. My name's Olivia Wilkinson. I'm the Director of Research at the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, which is an international collaboration on research and evidence related to religion and development. In early March, we had an email chain between Catherine, myself, Dave Robinson, and a few others. We started to notice a lot of reporting on religion and COVID, and we were interested in this. There was almost an influx of information coming in. So we started an initial conversation, which led to a resource repository, blogs, webinars, a daily email that's now gone to weekly, and our resource repository at the moment, which is full of news reports, journal articles, other types of resources related to this question of religion and COVID-19, is now at over 100 pages. And we're in fact hoping to rearrange that soon and make that available to you in a much more accessible way. But suffice to say, there's been a lot of information about religion and COVID. And that's been one of the interesting trends that I'd like to talk about first, that there's been a great visibility. In previous health crises, such as the Ebola response in 2014, 2015, it took a little while for the roles of religions to become obvious in the response. It was then game-changing once it became obvious, but it took some time. And there's been a certain reflection that this has not been the case this time with COVID-19. There's been lots of reporting, in fact. We've seen reporting on super spreader events around religious gatherings, spiritual support from religion for people in times of isolation and increased violence that's been happening during the pandemic, adaptations to gatherings and religious practices that have been needed, and also these examples of religious leaders going against public health information during the pandemic. But the question remains as to how much this visibility is really helping the response. On one hand, there's a fear that it could further misconceptions about the roles of religion in a public health crisis. When one story about a problem with religion is presented as representative of a whole, we could worry that there would be misperceptions propagated about, in fact, a lot of the good work that's also happening from religious communities. So how is this reporting actually shaping our response? In the response of humanitarian and development organizations, have we also learned the lessons from Ebola, from HIV, from other examples that we've had over the years? And we have some indication that faith engagement has been part of some of this response. For example, WHO created guidelines, and early on in March and April consulted with many faith actors about these guidelines and continue to create new guidelines. They've just put out some new guidelines for Eid al-Adha that just happened a few weeks ago, for example. So we've seen some examples of faith engagement, but this increased visibility of religions in response, but we still have many questions about what that's actually served to create and how we can learn from that as we continue into the months and years potentially of COVID-19. Another trend that we've seen is the roles of religions in misinformation and discrimination, but also counterbalanced by the roles of religions in sharing correct public health information and working against discrimination. Now, although misinformation and discrimination are separate topics, I bring these two together because of the ways in which purposeful misinformation can feed into discrimination. And one thing that we have to remind ourselves of continuously is that religions are not homogenous. They have profound internal diversity. It's an obvious point, but worth repeating, because as we see within denominations, within congregations, there's a full spectrum of responses. So there are religious leaders at the forefront of public health response, such as the role of chaplains and the chaplaincy, and also at the forefront of social response with food banks, with responses to domestic violence, with responses around mental health and spiritual support. In fact, many religious leaders have not stopped and faced burnout and increased susceptibility to the virus because of this. The issues of racism and response to refugees, our other two topics for today, are also the continued work of these religious communities, even as they have to pivot and change response during the pandemic. And then religious leaders seemingly in the minority, but we don't have exact statistics. There are some of these religious leaders who are purposely ignoring public health information, reopening or never closing religious buildings without proper precautions, spreading incorrect messages about the virus, its origins, and its treatment. The polarization we see in other aspects of society also has its effects on religious communities. The questions that remain are, who are these outliers? When and how does misinformation and discrimination become mainstream in some religious communities? How to counter these trends? I even saw some research coming out this morning, for example, that indicated that social inequalities are echoed in the impacts of COVID on different religious communities. So in North America, their research is pointing toward the fact that Hispanic Christian, Black Christian, and Muslim, Buddhist, and Jewish communities have been impacted more by COVID-19 than white Christian communities. And then we've got the basic point that we still don't know that much. More research is needed as we go into, again, these months and years ahead of us. We've been monitoring these news reports and early articles appearing in the resource repository that we have, but there are significant questions still to come, such as religious responses to the vaccinations that will come hopefully in the next months. How religious communities will change and use this pandemic as an inflection point, how religious and political divides and alignments will continue to shape religious communities' responses. What's clear, however, is that faith communities are to be found in every aspect of the COVID-19 response. And so if they are not included in policy decisions and at these decision-making tables, a critical actor will be missed. They're also part of and interrelated to a whole host of civil society actors working on the response. So as we think about this civil society response, I'd like to hand over to Ruth Messenger, who will tell us a little bit more about the response from American Jewish World Service. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you so much, Olivia. As she told you, my name is Ruth Messenger. I'm the former CEO of American Jewish World Service and now working with them as their global ambassador. And I'm fascinated and think it's hugely important that we're getting into this issue as we are. Olivia mentioned the whole range of issues. And I think I want to just say, I'm going to give you lots of examples and some other issues, but I want to say that this is, as was true with Ebola, and actually as was true with HIV/AIDS, this is in some ways a challenge to religions, faith-based organizations of different kinds, because no one wants them not to be able to profess what they believe and to work with their adherents. And at the same time, it turns out that there are major and dramatic questions of public health in which, at least from my point of view, they could be hugely helpful in protecting the health of their adherents and of the broader communities, or believing that it's sort of something other than what they do, they could drill down in ways that she's suggested, some of them are doing, in ways that turn out not only not to be helpful, but at least, again, from my point of view, to be quite destructive to people, including some of their constituents who are likely to get ill. So leaving that aside, because as Olivia said, the responses are varied, I want to talk a little bit about how American Jewish World Service has approached this. And I want to make the point that I often do when I'm honored to be asked by the Berkley Center to participate in these discussions. And that is that I represent a faith-based organization that works according to its faith principles and works in the Global South more broadly with organizations, many of which are secular, some of which have a clear religious base or bias, but which are essentially grassroots organizations that are themselves looking to make social change. So we are not always working directly with frontline leaders of faiths and faith organizations, but we find, as all of you would imagine, that wherever we're working, and it could be with just a secular organization in some country, the people in that organization have their own faith commitments, and so we bump up against these same issues that Olivia was mentioning, for sure. And now I want to take a half a step back and just say some of what we're finding as we work with COVID. And I should note that American Jewish World Service works in 19 different countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And in every one of our countries, we're working with some of our partner organizations on COVID issues, although, of course, none of those organizations imagined 6 months ago that they were going to be wrapped up in dealing with a world pandemic. So first of all, health issues. Now that may seem obvious. Of course, this is a health issue, but I want to point out that in some ways, precisely because the pandemic is threatening all of our communities in the most developed parts of the world, people don't always recognize that the things that we're learning that are necessary to combat COVID are things that simply don't exist in the Global South. So the lack of sophisticated medical equipment, the lack of access to soap and water, the impossibility of social distancing, the limit on mechanisms for massive public health education, these all make the problems infinitely more complicated, and they suggest areas in which local, grassroots, and faith-based organizations can step in, particularly around the issue of public health education. I want to make one other health point, which I think is probably known to the people listening, but not as broadly known as we might wish, and that is that in many parts of the world, the focus on COVID means that the focus on other health measures is likely to be derailed. That's everything from, in our countries, broadly defined, people who don't go and get flu shots because they're so worried about COVID. Doesn't make any sense, but it's true. But in the Global South, it means, for example, likely explosion of something like measles. But I want to switch now to say that what I think our faith-based organizations and our grassroots organizations on the ground understand better right now than many of the world leaders, and that is that the effects of this pandemic are devastatingly economic, and that where the pandemic spreads, people are unable to grow their food, they're unable to go to market, they're unable to barter, they're unable to feed their families. That hunger for sure is going to spread unless, again, we find effective ways to step in, both with health remedies and with better public education. So spiraling out from that, I would just mention that there are also devastating social and political ramifications. This really, for me, is what General Dallaire was talking about. If people are all equally made in the image of whatever force you believe in, then the use of the COVID pandemic and the use of various quote unquote public health and safety measures to make lives particularly difficult for one ethnic group or another, which is certainly happening in some countries around the world, is an extraordinary and problematic consequence. So as we work on COVID and COVID-related issues, we're looking to meet immediate needs and spread essential public health education information and get the faith-based organizations or that we work directly with, or the faith-based organizations in the countries where we work, to be partners in spreading that information. And we're also looking at building resilience and sustainability among local people, at increasing availability of and access to public health information, and big challenge where faith-based organizations could be extremely effective, and that is holding governments more accountable for protecting people's health. So we are doing probably already $3.5 million worth of relatively small COVID-related grants on all of these issues, trying to be broader than just providing for immediate emergency health interventions. But we are also looking for partners on the ground who understand their communities, who can think about ways to step in. And we have example after example of where our groups have stepped in, demanded a public health response because they see what's spreading, demanding that the local government step in to ensure that people will have enough food, even though the pandemic is spreading. And these are the examples that we would hold up as really effective ways to work. I want to come back before I end to this issue of public health education and information, because here I see right in my own city, in my own country, and in the places where we're privileged to work, the yin and yang that Olivia was speaking about, and that is people who are pursuing their faith-based practices in a way that actually contribute to the spread of the virus, as opposed to faith-based organizations that grapple, and believe me, I understand it involves a grappling, but that grapple with their faith principles, their ideas for how people should come together, for how to worship, with the fact that they don't want in any way, shape, or form to participate in spreading the virus. So we see examples on the ground of where local faith leaders are being engaged to talk about public health. And I thought I would give two examples that are not from our current COVID work, because that's of course still in process, but from two of the past pandemics where many of the rest of you also saw this at play. So one example was during the HIV/AIDS crisis, where I remember at an international conference, an Episcopal bishop saying, in response to HIV/AIDS, we are doing something we never thought we would do. We are telling our local parish priests that they must tell their congregants to discuss sex at the breakfast table. So he got a big laugh, but you all understand what he was saying was that within the confines of the religion and its beliefs and its practices, they recognized that they had a powerful public health job to do, and that they would be believed and respected more than the government. And my second example of that involves directly American Jewish World Service, when we were dealing with the issue of Ebola in several countries. And when we saw that in Liberia, where we work, the messages that were coming from the American aid experts and American health experts were not being believed because of geopolitical suspicions. We, as American Jewish World Service, actually made a public health education grant to the National Imam Council of Liberia, because we relied on the local imams who were desperate to spread useful information to share with their adherents and believers what they could do to protect the health of themselves and their families, even when that meant changing a comfortable religious ritual or practice. So I would just urge, as we cope with COVID moving forward, that we think about the partners in faith-based institutions and the partners in grassroots institutions on the ground, that we need to reach people directly with key public health information and with key economic information. We need to be sure that nobody is following practices that in fact contribute to the spread of the virus, and that many people are understanding and engaging with the broader issues of economic threat that this pandemic raises for all of us. I look forward to hearing from other people and to hearing some of those examples and to a more extended discussion of this on Wednesday. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I think you've highlighted an enormous range of issues with great insight and some provocative questions and challenges. I wish we had more time to go into this, but we do have the 3 days ahead. So we go to the third topic on which we're focusing, and I would introduce Ganoun Diop from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but also a leader in interfaith work, and Audrey Kitagawa, who is the chair of the trustees of the Parliament of the World's Religions, one of the major global interfaith organizations. So Ganoun, over to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for your kind words of introduction. It would not be an overstatement to suggest that we are witnessing and experiencing a historical moment during which the world is searching for its soul. There is what many have called a revolution, actually, against racism. A global mobilization to protest against racism has seen the day, unquestionably. One would hope, of course, that this means a development of a global consciousness of what it means to be human and to treat each other in more humane ways. There is a global no, one would say, to the trampling of any person's dignity. And that is core to today's resistance movement. And I can say also, there is also a global no to police brutality, a global no to law enforcement and vigilante unlawful biases and violence against people of African ancestry. The moment has been compared actually to the challenges the abolition of slavery presented in the 1850s. It seemed almost impossible. Today, the issue is the abolition of inequality and inequity. The challenge seems to be the stubborn belief in the inferiority of people of color in general and Black people in particular. This alleged inferiority has given rise to personal stigmatization of Black people, along with institutional, structural, and systemic racism which pervade all sectors of human relations and experiences for Black people. The context actually of the current mobilization against racism and violence against Black people is the murder of an African American. The history of African Americans who went through slavery, denial of citizenship by the Supreme Court, segregation, Jim Crow law, and a host of dehumanizing tactics and practices are too well documented and are also part of a guilt too massive and destructive to stifle. The belief in the inferiority of Black people has been nurtured not only to justify the various historical slaveries, and I'm referring here to, yes, the trans-Saharan slavery from the 7th century on, the Oriental slavery, the transatlantic, of course, which is the most known, the most well-known, the intra-African slavery also, but it has also been nurtured by religious texts of adherents of major religious traditions, assuming that Black people are actually inferior. And that is part of the problem. And I can say here a mixed record from religious traditions. Suffice it to mention the so-called curse of Ham, a misinterpretation of the text of Genesis 9 to promote the idea that Black people are cursed. Not to mention the so-called mark of Cain, also attributed to Black people. This criminal hierarchicalization and the racialization of the human family have made our world unsafe and actually a violent place. So the problems of racism are multifaceted, and so will be the solution. But before we get to that, I am privileged to ask Audrey to maybe expand our horizon of understanding of racism and discriminations by telling us something about the intersections between your own personal experience and racism. Audrey, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And I really want to thank you, Ganoun, for those introductory remarks. In this search during this historic moment of the world for its soul, as you put it, Ganoon, and the question which you posed about the intersections between racism, stigmatization, and my life experience, I would like to share that I recently produced a video to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Just this past Saturday, I was in a panel sponsored by the Parliament of the World's Religions Next Gen Task Force on the interfaith perspectives on nuclear weapons. Having had a world premiere of this video on August 6th and a rebroadcast on August 9th, the 2 days in August when the nuclear bombs were dropped on these two Japanese cities, the Next Gen Task Force wanted to address a multi-generational approach to nuclear weapons. During the question and answer period, this question was posed. What is your opinion about the moral position of the US that the use of nuclear weapons on civilian Japanese targets ended the war? Basically, I indicated that this argument is one of the end justifies the means. I said, we need to ask, why was a bomb dropped on the Japanese by the Americans? Germany and Italy were also considered enemies. Further, why, during World War II, were the Japanese who lived in the US forcibly interned in camps created to confine them behind barbed wire compounds patrolled by armed soldiers to ensure that no one could escape? They were literally prisoners denied the due process of law and all of the rights and privileges accorded to all US citizens under our constitutions. And yes, many of the Japanese interned were in fact US citizens. A presidential commission in 1982 identified racial prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership as the underlying causes of the government's internment program. On August 9th, the day the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, President Truman received a telegram from Samuel McCrae Cavert, a Protestant clergyman who pleaded with the president to stop the bombing before any further devastation by atomic bomb could be visited upon the Japanese people. 2 days later, Truman replied, "The only language they seem to understand is the one we have been using to bombard them. When you have to deal with a beast, you have to treat him as a beast." Here you have the classic dehumanization of a whole race of people to justify the killing of them en masse. And isn't this what Hitler did to the Jews? Totally dehumanize them, marginalize them, and then exterminate them? In challenging the constitutionality of Executive Order 9066, Fred Korematsu, a Japanese American who was a US citizen, argued that his rights and those of other Americans of Japanese descent had been violated. In Korematsu versus the United States, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in favor of the government, saying that military necessity overruled these civil rights. In his dissent, however, Justice Frank Murphy stated that the exclusion of Japanese Americans falls into the ugly abyss of racism. In Trump versus Hawaii in 2018, the Supreme Court explicitly repudiated and effectively overturned the Korematsu decision, characterizing it as gravely wrong the day it was decided and overruled it in the court of history. It was unfortunately too late for my paternal grandfather, who was summarily sent into a secret internment camp on the island of Oahu in Hawaii during World War II. He was a humble fisherman and on one day was just interned without notice, no due process, no notification to any of his family members. He just disappeared. Later on, my parents found him, but when he eventually returned home, my mother said he had completely changed. He returned home a frightened man and refused to talk about his experience during the internment. Soon after his release, he developed cancer and died. With his death went and any understanding of what sufferings he endured, and a valuable part of history died with him. What will the court of history say about our own conduct that continues to treat people of color as inferior and has allowed many situations of current state action that have killed Black people disproportionately and have put in cage facilities migrants and refugees and their children from countries south of the border? Now, Ganoon, from your perspective, how did we get to this pandemic of racism?
You know, a deep problem, well, I mentioned the issue of the inferiority of at least supposed, alleged inferiority of a segment of the human family. But there is a deeper problem, actually, even in a reverse manner, the belief in the superiority of a people group over another. Throughout history, it has been the same story. It is also part of the logic of empire building and slogans and propaganda, whether political, sociocultural, religious, as far back as we can go. Ancient Egyptians believed they were superior to others. The Assyrians then, the Babylonian, the Medes and the Persians, and the Greek, and one would remember that Aristotle wrote even about the hierarchy of races. For him, for example, the Greeks were superior to barbarians. And of course, the Romans and the Byzantine Empire and the Arab and then the Mongols, fasting forward to the European hegemony, especially during the Renaissance, the superiority of a segment of the world, of the human family, of another, perpetrated actually acts of dehumanization. And fundamentally, this is also consonant, or it goes with the legitimization of violence. And that has been the historical norm. We can go back to the Munera or the midday executions during the Roman Empire to assert again the power, the domination of the emperor against the other. So yes, we got where we are right now because of the legitimization of violence. That is one, I mean, clearly one of the norm, the historical norm. Now, of course, we don't have public executions as before, except, you know, through some violent terrorist groups. But still, the legitimization of violence is present, and it is acted out through racism, actually. Now, Audrey, how do we move, though, from where we are to a better place for the human family? We have heard, and I think it seems that a consensus is emerging somehow that we need to recover our humanity, one human family. What would you say? How can we move from where we are to where the human family could be?
Well, thank you, Ganoon. What I feel is important is for each person to understand that we have personal responsibility to actually develop our inner spiritual lives, our character, and our codes of conduct that are in alignment with honoring and respecting others. It is about changing mindsets, attitudes, and stopping participation in hierarchical systems that can render someone less than we are and create dehumanization processes that allow for the marginalization and mistreatment of others. Teaching ourselves about developing values, principles for living, and ultimately the heart of love and care for each other, all sentient beings and Mother Earth, will help us to find abhorrent conduct, whether in thought, word, and action, that is antithetical to our core values and principles for living, and which violate the golden rule of treating others as we would like to be treated. The importance of developing our inner life is to ultimately help us to become better people and to deepen our hearts that we may share our respect, kindness, and love with each other. One of the greatest ways that we can move out of self-absorption and pure self-interest and self-centeredness is through this very powerful word called seva. Seva is a Sanskrit word which means selfless service, where you give of yourself, your time, your commitment, and your resources to help others without looking for the return of any self-glorification or self-aggrandizement. Mother Teresa said, "Love cannot remain by itself. It has no meaning. Love has to be put into action, and that action is service." Our ethical, spiritual, and moral values are set forth in religious and sacred texts, and in contemporary times, the Parliament of the World Religions' signature document, the Global Ethic. I want to call attention to its first directive, which is respect for life and nonviolence. Nonviolence is not only physical, but also verbal and within the mind. The preamble of the Constitution of UNESCO declares that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. Many people are more and more willing to become activists and to manifest their values and what they truly care about through their activism. This activism, however, must always be undertaken with the view that whether dedicating ourselves to the elimination of racism, sexism, classism, or any cause, we must ensure that we are not conducting ourselves in predatory or exploitative ways that cause harm to others. When we truly do seva, we are putting our love into action that is unconditional. May we all be blessed to move from that place of true love, knowing that we may not live to see the benefit of what our love has brought forth into the world, but knowing that whatever legacy we leave behind, we have given each day along the way as we lived our lives, that it was done so with the help of the divine hand that cultivated the soil of our holy ground upon which we all stand. As I see the fervent dedication of many people today to devote their time and effort into this examination of racism, its history, consequences, and solutions, I am heartened to know that these important conversations are taking place. And may these conversations take us out of denial about our own failures, shortcomings, and blind spots, and prejudices that have caused harm and suffering to others. Even as we have these conversations, however, may we simultaneously work toward addressing the institutional and systemic racism that continues today, that has wrought inequalities in treatment, opportunities, and equal access to people of color, and increase our activism to help those in need. This is a special purview of religious and faith communities to bring solace to hearts that grieve, to feed the hungry, and to minister to the needs of the poor and the marginalized. And may our hearts in this and all efforts that we undertake be filled with great kindness and compassion. We must each transform ourselves and be willing to create the dilation of our lens of insularity to the global lens of engagement, and together embrace each other in love. Now, Ganoon, I turn the floor over to you to give the concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Audrey, and for your words of appeal to really recover our humanity. And I hear very clearly the call to selfless love. You know, the problems, the evil, and I can even say the sin of racism, they are multifaceted. So must be the solutions. The abolition of racism can only be achieved, and its toxic, nefarious, and harmful effects neutralized or mitigated when addressed from comprehensive perspectives. At personal level, it can be achieved through the regeneration of hearts and the healing of minds. Actually, the word repentance has a double sense of change of attitude in the Greek epistrophein, but also transformation of the mind, the metanoia. But at systemic and structural levels, laws in place to perpetuate racism must be changed, and rulings to make racism unlawful put in place. New amendments to constitutions may be one of the best ways to design a new trajectory in human consciousness about the necessity to welcome and embrace the dignity of every human person. Institutional structures geared towards maintaining the injustices of discrimination, the restrictions to having access to goods, to jobs, to housing, to positions, or simply to decent living must be reformed. This will, of course, necessitate a further mobilization beyond the streets to chambers of law, to chambers of lawmakers to perennially better the condition of living of the whole human family in peaceful coexistence, in all equity and equality before the law, but also before the sanctity of every person's life. Recovering that sense of one human family and the need for human solidarity and the need to change our perception of others. No more objects to be instrumentalized, but rather full human being to be respected in the dignity of difference that could take us to a better place. Catherine, we thank you, both of us, for this opportunity. We will have another session to go more in depth into this on Thursday afternoon, but we express already our gratitude for this historic event that we are all now participating in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ganoon and Audrey. That was a very thought-provoking, but also inspirational set of reflections and a dialogue between you that we appreciate. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We're actually, I've been reminded, over time, even though everyone has respected their time limits almost perfectly. So we can't go on with what is so many, what are so many questions that we might address. However, the good news is that we have sessions tomorrow, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and a final session on Friday where we will hear the outcomes and the ideas that have come out of those discussions. So it falls to me now only to thank you all so much for your contributions. Each one of you has brought great wisdom and provocative ideas. I thank our loyal and wonderful audience and look forward to the continuing discussions. So thank you all very much.